It was just before dawn when federal agents quietly surrounded a luxury home in South Florida. There were no flashing lights, no dramatic car chases, no helicopters hovering overhead. Instead, dozens of agents waited patiently, knowing the woman inside had spent years avoiding exactly this moment. To her neighbors, she appeared to be another successful businesswoman. She dressed elegantly, drove expensive cars, and entertained guests in upscale neighborhoods stretching from Florida to New York. But investigators believed they knew a very different version of the woman behind those walls. According to federal prosecutors, she wasn't simply moving cocaine. She was directing one of the largest Colombian trafficking organizations operating on the east coast of the United States. Her name was Eucaris Ceballos. Within law enforcement circles, however, she was known by another name, Doña Tulia. Witnesses would later testify that people feared disappointing her. Shipments worth millions of dollars allegedly moved at her direction. Couriers, stash house operators, distributors, and trusted lieutenants reportedly answered to her. She wasn't famous like Pablo Escobar. She didn't become a household name like Griselda Blanco. Yet prosecutors argued she commanded an organization capable of importing enormous quantities of cocaine into America during one of the bloodiest chapters of the international drug trade. Her trial would make history, not because she was the biggest trafficker ever prosecuted, but because she became the first woman convicted under America's strengthened federal drug kingpin statute, a law designed specifically to dismantle criminal empires by targeting those at the very top. How did a woman whose early life remains largely undocumented become one of the most powerful alleged traffickers prosecuted during the height of the cocaine epidemic? To answer that question, we have to go back to Colombia. Long before the DEA knew her name, long before wiretaps, long before informants, and long before federal agents surrounded her home. Health Wealth Diary presents the real cocaine godmother and America's first female drug kingpin. This is the Eucaris Ceballos story. To understand Eucaris Ceballos, you first have to understand Colombia during the 1970s and early 1980s. This was a nation experiencing profound change. Political instability, economic inequality, and decades of internal conflict had created fertile ground for organized crime. In rural areas, opportunities were scarce. Cities grew rapidly as people migrated in search of work. Meanwhile, an entirely new global market was emerging. Americans wanted cocaine, not just a little. Demand exploded. Throughout the 1970s, cocaine transformed from an expensive party drug used by celebrities and wealthy elites into a booming black market commodity. The profits were unlike anything criminal organizations had ever seen. A kilogram purchased in South America for a few $1,000s could be sold in American cities for 10 times that amount. Every successful shipment represented millions of dollars. The risks were enormous, but so were the rewards. While names like Pablo Escobar would eventually dominate newspaper headlines, hundreds of lesser-known traffickers quietly built fortunes behind the scenes. Many would never become famous. Some intentionally avoided publicity. Others were overshadowed by larger cartels despite moving staggering amounts of narcotics. Federal investigators later argued that Eucaris Ceballos belonged in this second category. She wasn't known for public displays of violence. Instead, prosecutors described her as an organizer, someone who allegedly managed people rather than personally transporting drugs herself. Unlike famous cartel leaders whose lives were chronicled extensively, very little verified information exists about her childhood. Court records reveal almost nothing about her upbringing. Journalists covering her trial focused primarily on the criminal allegations rather than her personal history. There are no widely accepted biographies, no detailed interviews, no memoirs. In many ways, Ceballos remains a mystery before she entered federal court. What is known comes almost entirely from trial evidence, investigative reports, and testimony presented during one of the most significant narcotics prosecutions of the late 1980s. And that evidence paints the picture of a woman prosecutors believed had quietly built an empire stretching hundreds of miles. Nobody knows precisely when Eucaris Ceballos entered the cocaine business. Some investigators believe she gradually became involved through existing Colombian trafficking networks already operating inside the United States. Others suggest she earned increasing responsibility because of her ability to organize complex operations rather than because of personal notoriety. Whatever the exact path, by the mid-1980s, federal investigators believed she occupied a leadership role. Witnesses referred to her using the respectful title Doña Tulia. In many Latin American cultures, Doña is an honorific conveying respect or status. In the government's case, the nickname was presented as evidence that associates viewed her as an authority figure within the organization. According to prosecutors, the organization she allegedly directed extended from Colombia to the northeastern United States. Its primary markets included New York and New Jersey. South Florida also played an important role because it served as a major gateway for cocaine entering the country during that era. Investigators alleged that trusted couriers transported cocaine into the United States, after which the drugs were moved through stash locations before reaching wholesale distributors. As investigators slowly pieced together the organization, they found something striking. This wasn't a loose collection of smugglers. According to prosecutors, it resembled a structured business. Individuals allegedly had defined roles. Some stored cocaine, others transported cash, some arranged meetings, others acted as intermediaries between suppliers and distributors. Federal investigators believe the organization had become remarkably efficient, but efficiency creates patterns. And patterns are exactly what investigators look for. Every phone call, every meeting, every recurring address, every familiar face. Each small detail seemed insignificant on its own. Together, they began forming a picture. At first, the DEA didn't know exactly who sat at the center of the network. But as surveillance expanded, interviews multiplied, and confidential sources began talking, one name reportedly surfaced again and again: Eucaris Ceballos, the woman many allegedly called Doña Tulia. By the time federal investigators fully appreciated the scale of the organization they believed they were confronting, the case had already become one of the DEA's most ambitious narcotics investigations on the East Coast, and they were only beginning to uncover how vast it truly was. The Drug Enforcement Administration, working alongside federal prosecutors and local law enforcement, started building what they believed was a comprehensive picture of the organization. Surveillance teams watched suspected associates. Investigators reviewed travel records. Telephone records became increasingly important. Although modern investigators rely heavily on digital technology, agents in the 1980s spent enormous amounts of time conducting physical surveillance. Hours inside parked cars, days following suspects through crowded cities, weeks documenting routines. Patience often mattered more than speed. As investigators identified additional members of the alleged organization, they noticed something remarkable. Many appeared connected through one central figure. According to prosecutors, that figure was Eucaris Ceballos. But believing someone leads an organization is not enough. Federal prosecutors needed evidence, solid evidence. Evidence that could survive cross-examination before a jury. That meant finding insiders. People willing to cooperate. People who had once participated in the organization. Drug conspiracies often begin falling apart from the inside. One arrest leads to another. Someone accepts a plea agreement. Another person decides prison is worse than cooperation. Little by little, silence begins to crack. That is exactly what prosecutors argued happened here. Several individuals eventually agreed to testify for the government. Their testimony became one of the foundations of the case against Ceballos. They described meetings, drug deliveries, money collections, organizational structure. Most importantly, they identified who they claimed was giving the orders. Federal investigators also turned to one of the most powerful tools available at the time, court-authorized wiretaps. Unlike Hollywood movies, wiretaps rarely capture dramatic confessions. Instead, they record ordinary conversations. People involved in organized crime rarely speak openly. They often rely on coded language, references that sound meaningless to outsiders. The challenge for investigators is understanding the code. Months of surveillance helped provide that context. As conversations accumulated, prosecutors believed they were hearing members of the organization discuss activities consistent with drug trafficking. Those recordings would later become important evidence during trial. By late 1987, investigators believed they had enough. Months of surveillance had become years. Witnesses were prepared. Evidence had accumulated. Federal prosecutors believed the time had come to dismantle the organization they had spent so long investigating. Before the sun rose over South Florida, federal agents were already in position. For months, they had planned this moment. Every search warrant had been reviewed. Every arrest team had been briefed. Every target had been assigned. According to federal investigators, the raids marked the culmination of one of the largest cocaine investigations on the East Coast at the time. As doors were kicked down and suspects were taken into custody, agents searched homes, vehicles, and properties linked to members of the alleged organization. Among those arrested was the woman prosecutors identified as the organization's leader, Eucaris Ceballos. For years, investigators alleged she had remained insulated from much of the day-to-day risk. Now she found herself at the center of a federal criminal case carrying some of the most severe penalties available under American law. Prosecutors accused her of leading a continuing criminal enterprise, a charge reserved for individuals alleged to organize and supervise large-scale narcotics operations. If convicted, the consequences would be extraordinary. By the time the trial approached, prosecutors had spent years preparing. They understood that proving someone personally possessed drugs was one thing. Proving they led an international trafficking organization was something entirely different. The government needed to convince 12 jurors beyond a reasonable doubt that Eucaris Ceballos wasn't simply associated with traffickers. They needed to show she exercised authority over them. That required witnesses, documents, telephone recordings, surveillance, and above all, a coherent story. Some of the government's most important witnesses were former members of the alleged organization. These cooperating witnesses described how the operation allegedly worked. They testified about cocaine deliveries, money collections, meetings, and the movement of shipments between states. Several identified Eucaris Ceballos as the person they claimed directed important decisions. For prosecutors, these witnesses helped explain the internal structure of an organization that otherwise appeared invisible from the outside. Defense lawyers argued these individuals had every incentive to exaggerate or even fabricate their testimony to satisfy prosecutors. That became one of the central themes of the defense. Can testimony from admitted drug traffickers be trusted, or are they simply saying whatever benefits themselves? It was a question only the jury could answer. Federal prosecutors attempted to demonstrate that the organization handled enormous amounts of cash inconsistent with legitimate income. Although following illicit money was challenging in the 1980s, prosecutors believed they had enough evidence to show the alleged enterprise operated on a massive scale. The legal centerpiece of the case, however, remained the continuing criminal enterprise charge. Often called the drug kingpin statute, it was designed to reach beyond individual drug transactions. To secure a conviction, prosecutors had to prove more than participation in drug trafficking. They needed to establish that the defendant occupied a leadership role over multiple participants while deriving substantial income from the enterprise. It was one of the most demanding and most consequential drug charges available under federal law. If successful, the punishment could mean life imprisonment. By the time closing arguments arrived, the trial had become one of the most closely watched federal narcotics prosecutions of its kind. For weeks, jurors had listened to testimony from federal agents, cooperating witnesses, and legal experts. They had heard recordings from court-authorized wiretaps. They had reviewed documents, surveillance reports, and evidence that prosecutors argued showed the existence of a highly organized cocaine trafficking network. On November 29, 1988, a jury found Eucaris Ceballos guilty on multiple federal narcotic charges, including operating a continuing criminal enterprise, the federal drug kingpin statute. The verdict marked a significant victory for federal prosecutors. It also made national headlines. According to contemporary reporting, Ceballos became the first woman convicted under the strengthened federal drug kingpin law enacted in the mid-1980s. Several weeks after the verdict, Eucaris Ceballos returned to federal court for sentencing. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In addition to the life sentence, the court imposed a multi-million-dollar financial penalty. To understand the significance of her conviction, it's important to remember what was happening in the United States at the time. By the late 1980s, cocaine, and especially crack cocaine, had become one of the country's most pressing public concerns. Television news featured almost daily stories about drug-related violence. Politicians from both major parties called for stronger enforcement. Congress passed tougher sentencing laws. Federal agencies received increased funding. The message from Washington was clear. The government intended to pursue not only dealers on street corners, but also the people believed to be directing criminal organizations from behind the scenes. The prosecution of Eucaris Ceballos became one of the earliest high-profile examples of that strategy being used successfully against a woman. Following her conviction and sentence, Ceballos exercised her right to appeal. Her legal team challenged aspects of the trial, arguing that errors had occurred during the proceedings. Appeals are common in complex federal criminal cases, particularly those involving lengthy trials and severe sentences. Ultimately, the appellate court upheld the conviction. The court found no basis to overturn the jury's verdict. With that decision, the legal process largely came to an end. Her sentence remained in place. One of the most striking aspects of this story is what happened afterward, or perhaps more accurately, what didn't happen. Unlike many organized crime figures whose names continued appearing in newspapers for years, Eucaris Ceballos largely disappeared from public attention after her appeals. There were no dramatic prison escapes, no sensational interviews, no return to criminal activity, no best-selling memoir. For historians, this silence presents a challenge. There is relatively little publicly available information about her later life beyond the outcome of her federal case. That absence of information has contributed to her fading from popular memory. The story of Eucaris Ceballos is not one of celebrity. It is a story about the intersection of crime, law, and history. It is the story of a woman whom federal prosecutors described as the leader of a major cocaine trafficking organization. It is the story of an investigation built over years through surveillance, wiretaps, and witness testimony. It is the story of a trial that resulted in a landmark conviction under one of America's toughest federal drug laws. And it is also the story of how quickly history can forget those who once stood at the center of extraordinary events. Today, her name rarely appears outside legal archives and historical discussions of the war on drugs. Yet her prosecution marked a turning point in the federal government's campaign against organized narcotics trafficking. Whether one views the outcome as a triumph of law enforcement, a reflection of the era's harsh sentencing policies, or both, the case remains a window into one of the most turbulent periods in modern American criminal justice. More than 3 decades later, the questions raised by that era about organized crime, international drug trafficking, mandatory sentencing, and the limits of enforcement continue to shape public debate. The story of Eucaris Ceballos, remembered by prosecutors as Doña Tulia, is one chapter in that much larger history. And while the headlines have faded, the case itself remains part of the enduring legacy of the war on drugs. Thank you for watching. Do you think Eucaris Ceballos was truly the mastermind behind the organization, or was she simply the person the government managed to bring down? And why do you think her name has been almost completely forgotten while other cocaine kingpins became legends? Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more awesome videos from the Health Wealth Diary.
No fugazi stuff, man.